Snow White's story in this film begins with a vivid prologue that differs considerably from the classic 1937 animated version. We open on a bustling kingdom ruled by a benevolent king and queen, played here by Hadley Fraser and Lorena Andrea. Though their domain endures harsh winters, they've embraced a philosophy of kindness that shapes how they govern. It's implied that when the queen goes into labor during a blizzard, she and the king decide to name their newborn daughter Snow White to honor both the chill of the storm and the purity they hope she'll embody. From an early age, Snow White accompanies her parents throughout the kingdom, handing out loaves of bread, pies, or warm blankets to the less fortunate. In an uplifting musical introduction, one of several new numbers in the film, we see how the royal family's generosity unites the people, who sing about good things growing from kindness and neighborly goodwill. However, this idyllic existence falters when the queen falls gravely ill. Despite the kingdom's best efforts, she dies, leaving the king grief-stricken and Snow White without a mother. The king later remarries a strikingly beautiful woman, known only as the Evil Queen, portrayed by Gadot. At first, the new monarch seems poised to continue the legacy of compassion left behind by Snow White's mother. We see her greeting villagers in splendid attire, showing off a certain star power that intrigues the court. Yet small glimpses of her vanity emerge, hinting that her kindness is merely a facade. Over time, the Evil Queen's true nature comes to light. She commands mysterious magic. She holds private consultations with a sentient magic mirror, voiced by Patrick Page. And she nurses an obsession with being the fairest of them all. As the film clarifies, in this updated version, fairest refers not just to physical beauty, but also to a sense of moral fairness and generosity. When a perceived threat arises to the south, the Evil Queen convinces the king to depart on a crusade. In the last scene Snow White has with her father, he tenderly bids her farewell, promising to return. But he never does, an absence that grows more suspicious as we learn how ruthless the queen can be. The kingdom descends into turmoil, farmland withers, taxes skyrocket, and the once celebratory spirit gives way to gloom. The film uses this shift to show the stark contrast between the earlier era of generosity and the new era of fear. Snow White, now a teenager portrayed by Rachel Zegler, is hidden away from public view, forced to serve as a scullery maid in her own palace. By keeping the rightful princess confined to menial chores, the queen hopes to prevent the magic mirror from fixating on Snow White's inherent qualities of compassion and grace. Meanwhile, we meet a roguish figure named Jonathan, Andrew Burnap, a bandit who sneaks into the castle to steal food. Jonathan is more than a petty thief. He's a kind of Robin Hood, pilfering supplies to redistribute among the starving villagers. His capture by the Evil Queen's guards sets in motion a crucial scene. Snow White, seeing Jonathan bound and humiliated at the gate, appeals to her stepmother, pleading for mercy and for recognition of the kingdom's widespread suffering. The queen dismisses Snow White with chilling indifference, revealing how little compassion she has for her people. In a small but pivotal act of rebellion, Snow White frees Jonathan later that night, handing him some bread and urging him to flee. This moment also marks the first instance in which we see Snow White's resolute kindness override her fear of the queen. She cannot stand by while others are persecuted. Not long afterward, the Evil Queen consults the magic mirror and receives a revelation she's dreaded for years. Snow White is, in fact, the fairest in the land. Here the film clarifies that fairest does not merely refer to physical beauty, but to a broader sense of moral goodness. The queen, vain and terrified that someone else might overshadow her, hires the huntsman, Ansukabia, to kill Snow White, demanding proof of the deed by requiring her heart in a box. With minimal delay, the huntsman tracks Snow White deep in the woods, where we find her peacefully gathering apples. He raises his blade, but she neither screams nor flees. Instead, she asks why he intends to hurt her. Overwhelmed by her innocence and forthrightness, the huntsman finds he cannot kill the princess. He confesses the queen's order, then urges Snow White to flee into the forbidden forest if she hopes to survive. The narrative transitions to a more visually symbolic sequence, as Snow White runs through the thick woods. Gnarled branches and illusory shapes loom, creating a sense of disorientation reminiscent of the famed scary forest scene in the original 1937 movie. Over time, the film overlays some expressionistic imagery, letting the environment reflect Snow White's panic. Eventually, she collapses in exhaustion, only to be comforted by small woodland creatures which gather around her. Rabbits, birds, and deer all approach, reflecting her kind aura. They lead her to a secluded cottage, where she drifts into sleep. When morning comes, the Seven Dwarfs return from a day's labor in the diamond mines, introduced by a newly expanded version of Hi-Ho. Each dwarf receives a bit more characterization than in the original. They suspect Snow White is some kind of bandit who broke into their home. The dwarfs rummage through their living space with comedic panic, until Dopey accidentally locked in the same room as Snow White recognizes her as harmless. One by one, they warm up to her, but Grumpy in particular worries that harboring the princess will bring them all trouble from the evil queen. Once Snow White explains her circumstances, not realizing the queen is already certain she's still alive, the dwarfs decide they cannot, in good conscience, send her away. They sense something extraordinary in her unyielding faith and kindness. Though the dwarfs are understandably cautious, especially Grumpy, who warns that the queen's wrath is no small thing, Snow White persuades them that living in fear is not the answer. In this adaptation, the dwarfs bear mystical markings on their hands that allow them to manipulate the diamonds in the mine, which they sell or trade to survive. Snow White sees them as skilled, industrious, but also lonely souls in need of friendship. Meanwhile, back at the palace, the evil queen imprisons the huntsman after realizing he presented her with a simple apple in the ornate box instead of Snow White's heart. She engages in a dramatic musical number, essentially a villain's anthem, in which she gloats over her command of dark magic and her rightful place on the throne. This moment extends the character's presence in a way the original film never did, letting Gal Gadot posture with a grandiose flamboyance that underscores the queen's descent into paranoia. After settling in at the dwarf's cottage, Snow White shares a simple meal with her new companions, and comedic mishaps ensue. A bowl of soup falls on Dopey's head, and the dwarfs roar with laughter at his expense. Crestfallen, Dopey leaves, and Snow White follows him outside to encourage him. She coaxes him to express himself through whistling and teaches him to turn his frustration into something playful. The others come out, and soon, in a newly reworked Whistle While You Work, the dwarfs collaborate in a silly, energetic jam session that forges a deeper bond within the group. This gentle interlude underscores a central theme. Kindness lifts spirits, bridging the gap between individuals and forging unexpected friendships. Not long after, Snow White ventures into the forest to gather berries. There she runs into Jonathan again, who is traveling with his own team of bandits. We discover that these men and women were once loyal subjects of the king who have turned to outlaw tactics to undermine the queen's oppressive regime. Jonathan recognizes Snow White's face from the castle, but did not fully grasp her royal identity until now. They share a playful argument, culminating in him mocking her princess problems, while she scolds him for occasionally stealing property to survive. Rather than skirting around their differences, they form a rapport that is half banter, half genuine admiration. Their meeting is cut short when the queen's guards storm the forest, having tracked Snow White's movements. Attempting to buy her time to escape, Jonathan steps forward. He even intercepts an arrow meant for Snow White, taking the hit in his shoulder. The outnumbered bandits retreat, carrying Jonathan, and Snow White leads them all to the dwarf's cottage for shelter. In a tense but heartfelt sequence, Doc concocts a remedy using diamonds from the mine to heal Jonathan's wound, revealing that these gemstones possess magical or medicinal properties. While Jonathan recovers, Snow White checks on him, feeling both guilty that he was hurt on her behalf and quietly elated at this blossoming connection. The dwarfs and Jonathan's bandit allies can't ignore the romantic tension, though both are a bit shy to admit it. Tragically, word of this hideout soon reaches the evil queen. Her guards capture Jonathan during a later raid and haul him to the dungeons, where he ends up imprisoned beside the disgraced huntsman. The queen exults in having captured Snow White's rumored companion, hoping to lure the princess out of hiding. She snatches the beloved necklace that once belonged to Snow White's mother, planning to use it as bait in a final ploy. Determined to end Snow White herself, she retires to a hidden chamber where she brews a frightening potion. In a reprise of her earlier villainous ballad, the queen transforms into an old hag, exactly as in the original tale, but with a bit more visual flair. Bent on trickery, she grabs the necklace and sets off to the dwarf's cottage. Around this time, the dwarfs leave for their routine work. Snow White, unfortunately, remains at home alone. The disguised evil queen arrives, wearing a frail old lady facade and brandishing the necklace to convince Snow White that Jonathan is gravely hurt and languishing in captivity. Distraught for Jonathan's sake, Snow White lowers her guard, allowing the hag to offer her an apple dipped in poison. As soon as Snow White bites into it, the evil queen drops the charade, revealing her true identity, and that she was responsible for the king's mysterious disappearance, implying he was murdered on her orders. Snow White collapses in a death-like state, cursed by the so-called sleeping death. By the time the dwarfs return from the mine, they find only her motionless body. Devastated, the dwarfs lay Snow White on a large, flower-adorned rock in the forest, reminiscent of the glass coffin from the animated film, though not quite the same. They keep vigil around her, mourning the princess who first inspired them to hope. Meanwhile, Jonathan breaks out of the dungeon with help from the remorseful huntsman, who sees a chance at redemption. Jonathan races to the forest, guided by the dwarf's laments. He finds Snow White, apparently lifeless, and kisses her in a final plea of love. That act breaks the spell, reviving her. It's a classic moment in line with the original, but portrayed with an emphasis on their blossoming relationship, making it feel more earned than a sudden rescue from a stranger. Reunited with Snow White, the dwarfs and Jonathan vow that they will no longer hide. They encourage Snow White to rally everyone, farmers, merchants, bandits, the dwarfs themselves, to overthrow the evil queen. Waiting on a Wish reprise underscores this plan, turning the once gentle melody into a determined anthem of hope and resistance. Returning to the kingdom, Snow White appears at the main gates, refusing to cower before her stepmother. The evil queen emerges in full regalia, flanked by guards who are ordered to execute Snow White on the spot. But Snow White addresses each guard by name, reminding them of their earlier lives as bakers, blacksmiths, or stable hands. She recalls how her father once asked them to defend the kingdom not through cruelty, but through courage and compassion. Moved by her words, the guards pivot their allegiance. The evil queen shrieks in fury and tries to hurl her own magic dagger at Snow White, but Jonathan and the dwarfs intervene, blocking the attack. Having lost her hold on the kingdom, the queen flees to the throne room, with Snow White in close pursuit. In a final display of desperation, the queen demands the magic mirror reaffirm her as the fairest. However, the mirror now stands firmly with Snow White, effectively condemning the queen's hateful vanity. Enraged, the evil queen smashes the mirror, unleashing a surge of dark energy that consumes her and seals her inside the restored glass. Lightning crackles across its surface, and when it stills, the evil queen is gone, trapped by her own destructive powers. A triumphant epilogue follows. Freed from oppressive taxes and forced service, the kingdom gradually returns to the warmth and celebration we glimpsed in the early scenes. Snow White is crowned as the rightful monarch, and the dwarfs stand proudly by her side. A joyous wedding ceremony unites Snow White and Jonathan, reaffirming the moral of the story, that true fairness lies in generosity, empathy, and valor, not in superficial beauty or iron-fisted control. In a closing voiceover twist, we discover that Dopey, now speaking freely, narrates the entire story to future generations, preserving the legacy of the princess who turned the tide. The final scene circles back to the notion of good things grow, capturing the return of music, dance, and community to a kingdom that once nearly succumbed to tyranny. Throughout this adaptation, Disney takes several departures from the original. The newly fleshed-out romance with Jonathan, the extra dimension given to the dwarf's magical abilities, and the extended role for the evil queen, with Gal Gadot delivering flamboyant villainy in her posture, if not always in her vocal range. Rachel Zegler's performance as Snow White shines particularly bright, elevating the character from a timid young woman to one with real agency and courage. Much of the film's thematic weight centers on kindness as a revolutionary force, positioning Snow White as a unifying figure who inspires both dwarfs and humans to fight back through compassion rather than cruelty. At the same time, the film weaves in small comedic beats, especially through the dwarfs' daily routines and the banter between Snow White and Jonathan. Set pieces such as Snow White's flight into the forest are presented with an almost psychedelic flair, echoing the original's hallucinatory imagery, but enhanced by modern visuals. While some critics find the CGI dwarfs uncanny and the production design overly garish, the movie attempts to offset that with a Broadway-like energy in its musical numbers. Pasek and Paul's new songs may not have the timelessness of Someday My Prince Will Come, but they unify the cast and further the story's message. Ultimately, Snow White 2024 emerges as a retelling that, while still anchored in the familiar plot beats, invests heavily in the emotional arcs of its characters. By layering in more pointed commentary about oppression, resource distribution, and community mobilization, it feels more overtly political than the 1937 classic, albeit with a simple kid-friendly framework. The final verdict among audiences might hinge on how they judge the film's modern expansions or its occasionally uneven CGI, yet the core takeaway remains that Snow White's unwavering kindness and willingness to unify people from all walks of life sets her apart as the true, fairest of them all. In the closing moments, as confetti rains down and joyous villagers cheer, Snow White and Jonathan begin their reign as equals. The dwarfs, no longer outcasts, stand among the crowd, each recognized for the unique flair and sense of purpose they bring. Magic returns to the land, not in the form of dark curses or illusions, but in the form of everyday compassion apple pies baked for neighbors, forgiven debts, and mended friendships. The camera lingers on Snow White's hopeful smile, a final reminder that even in the face of vanity, cruelty, and despair, the simplest acts of care can restore a broken kingdom. Then the credits roll, accompanied by a celebratory reprise of the film's earliest number, folding the story into a tapestry of renewal and joy. That is how the live-action Snow White concludes. A princess once confined to scrubbing floors stands victorious, showing that power built on fear will never outlast the warmth of genuine love and kindness. The evil queen, consumed by her own destructive power, vanishes into the very mirror that once fueled her vanity. And as for Snow White, she ascends to the throne not simply because she's heir to it, but because she's proven herself the rightful ruler through courage, empathy, and an inclusive vision for her future kingdom.